which is a game I wasn't quite expecting to put at the top of my list there. But basically there, I think that you're looking at a game that on PS5 is delivering you one ray tracing feature, which is dynamic diffuse global illumination. On PS5, you're getting RTAO and RT transparency and opaque reflections. And that just adds so much to the experience. Like, I do have some footage here that maybe you can use, but basically it's giving you like a generational leap in the fidelity of that lighting. You're getting RT reflections all over the place, on the cars, on the track, on transparent surfaces on the side of tracks like Silverstone. In indirectly lit areas, that's like areas that are in shadow on the track, you're getting this really fine lighting presentation because you get that ray traced ambient occlusion, and it just looks like a universe better. So to me, that's a game that on PC gives you all those ray tracing features, and you basically get the majority of that ray tracing feature set on PlayStation 5, whereas on PlayStation 5 Pro, whereas on PlayStation 5, before you had to contend with a much more limited set of that feature set. Now they're basically going all out with the ray tracing. It looks really, really impressive. They're using PSSR there, and they also have a 4K 120 FPS mode and an 8K 60 mode there as well. So it's just like the whole package, really exciting looking, and I think one of the top games. So for GT7, there was a pretty impressive demo showing off the ray tracing in particular. There are two modes there. There's a ray tracing priority mode and an image quality priority mode. And Polyphony did provide the exact same replay footage for us as well in the Sony assets that we were given. So we can actually see this exact same race playing out on PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 5 Pro. I think with real-time cube maps, which is what they were using before, that can look pretty good, but you end up with problems where they're not quite perspective correct on the cars. They look a little bit warbled. The cars don't have self-reflections of their bodywork. Mirrors don't have accurate reflections of their environments, like the car mirrors and the sides of the cars. And small reflective elements don't really reflect properly because the buildings off track don't get RT reflections. And it doesn't seem like the surfaces of the track don't get RT reflections either. They're relying on screen space reflections. They're maybe relying on cube maps and things like that. They're not actually getting that full RT treatment. So it's just on the cars, it seems like to me so far. Also, image quality takes a little bit of a hit. So I think the PS5 is resolving a more stable image overall. There it's native 4K. In the PS5 Pro mode, the ray tracing mode, I was counting it out at about 1440p there during gameplay, and it closer to like 1200p or 1152p during the replays there. So it is using PSSR, and it is reasonably effective, but I think the game is presenting a lot of challenging content, especially now with that ray tracing in there, the high contrast visuals, the really fast gameplay. It's just tough for it to really effectively anti-alias. And so we do see a bit of an image quality regression. I've set it up, I believe, is that basically they have an image quality priority mode that on a 4K panel will target 4K 60, and on an 8K panel will target 8K 60. So there, it did look pretty great on an 8K panel. They're also using PSSR there as well. So they wouldn't be pressed on like the internal resolutions they're running at, which is a detail that we always are curious about. And indeed, if we had some 8K footage, perhaps we could give you that information. But it's probably using a much lower internal resolution. Based on what we know about PSSR, it demands a GPU time on the PlayStation 5 Pro of roughly 2 milliseconds at 4K output. So here, targeting 8K output, it's probably a lot higher than that. It seemed like the ray traced global illumination that they have in that game was not interacting very well with the PSSR, and it was being reprojected incorrectly throughout the scene. And so I was getting a lot of artifacts in that reprojection. But I do expect that's probably a temporary issue. I don't think that that will probably make ship. Maybe it will, but I think it is an issue that they would note, and they would probably there as they're trying to pull off something closer to 60 FPS. Now,
closer to.
Closer, yeah. So we actually did some frame rate analysis at Digital Foundry just off the footage they provided, and we found that it was usually running in the 50s there. In person, it was running in like the 40s and 50s in that city area, which is pretty impressive because on PlayStation 5, at least the last time we checked, and we need to check it again because they have patched the game subsequently, but it was more like the 30s and 40s. So if they are achieving that frame rate uplift relative to PS5 there, that is pretty impressive. But at the same time, Dragon's Dogma 2 is just one of those games, and Capcom has a bit of a history of this, of kind of like very high quality graphics, but somewhat inconsistent quality in terms of configuration. And then some weird issues like the fact that the city in that area, or the city in that game rather, is super, super CPU heavy and just kind of destroys modern CPUs, especially those in the consoles. So it's maybe not the ideal game to show off for PlayStation 5 Pro. They're also using PSSR there, and the PSSR looks quite good. The internal res I counted there was about 1080p, but it looks better than the checkerboarding solution they had before for sure there. So kind of a mix of good and bad stuff, but it really is just that kind of one issue that did stand out there. But all the other games I saw did not have corresponding issues. Let's say they all looked very demanding on the base console as well, and they aren't quite being brought up to that higher level of refresh because not every game is hitting 60 FPS in the base PS5 already. And then also one separate issue that could pop up in some games is that ray tracing, because of its need to create a BVH and manage all this stuff in the background for that ray tracing process, actually incurs a CPU cost as well. So if you have a PS5 game, you're bringing it to Pro, you're adding a ray tracing feature, performance mode or the PS5 Pro equivalent. I think with the Sony first-party studios, they're tending to dub their new PS5 Pro modes with the suffix Pro. So it's the performance Pro mode, I suppose, in this case. It is fairly comparable to the fidelity mode, I would say, and I think that Insomniac's PSSR implementation in their games does look very, very good. There was some side-by-sides of the footage that we were provided that I put together, and also I saw it in person, but the PS5 Pro definitely looks a lot more detailed, less aliased, and more stable than the base PS5 footage in its performance mode. And relative to the fidelity mode, it kind of looks similar enough. The resolve doesn't quite look the same. It looks a little bit softer, but quite detailed, and it's prone to different kinds of breakup. Like in the fidelity mode on PS5, you see kind of a more even breakup throughout the image, whereas on PS5 Pro, it seems like you get more detail in the far distance, or more breakup in the far distance rather, but closer to the camera, it seems to do a better job with elements like spike 1152p pretty often. So it's pretty similar to that PS5 version, but it looks a lot cleaner and looks a lot sharper because they are putting GPU time into that PSSR process. So it does look quite good. They also have been tweaking it a little bit. Like they mentioned, I spoke to Mike Fitzgerald, who's the core technology director at Insomniac. He mentioned that they had removed a little bit more aliased in some of the footage that we saw last week than it probably should have been. And they basically found with PSSR that because it's so effective at upscaling the image, they basically no longer needed that sharpening step, which is kind of like edge enhancement to bring out those.
I'm pretty cynical about the remake. I never felt like it needed it, but taking a look at the footage side by side, they're actually doing some really interesting stuff with lighting. Definitely the native resolution seems crisper. Just taking a quick look at the two scenes we were provided, Seattle day one and something near the end of the game.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about Last of Us? The lighting was very noticeable looking at them side by side on my edits.
I've a PS5 Pro performance mode, but then they're also providing you the old graphics mode and the old performance mode to look at, to kind of gawk at, because they feel confident that when you look at that new performance Pro mode, that you don't really need a 30 FPS mode, that they're very happy with image quality in that mode. The new Performance Pro mode, they confirmed to me, is using PSSR to upscale from 1440p to 4K. And subjectively speaking, it does look a lot like a native 4K render. Now, actually resolving substantially more detail, interestingly, than the old 4K fidelity mode, which was a negative 4K presentation. That is something that we do see with PSSR sometimes, where the upsampling is so affected. It's more similar to that performance mode, I would say. So it's not quite there completely in terms of that image stability. Again, this is something that we do see in some titles, like with Final Fantasy, for instance, where there's a little bit of a compromise there between getting a super sharp image and maybe getting a super stable image. And we've seen Insomniac grapple with that a little bit and make some changes there. So it's possible, it's entirely possible that maybe a step in their TAA process that's sort of vestigial now, maybe a sharpening step, could be causing some of those issues, right? So kind of wait and see on that one, but that certainly was my impression there. In the lighting position, there's also some differences in shadow position, and then there's also an issue where the depth of field was not displaying correctly on PlayStation 5 Pro, which is a common issue with upscalers, right? Mm-hmm. Because it is streaming through the canopy, you get more of that effect here. I'm not entirely sure that is 100% intentional here. I suspect that may just be an artifact of their kind of development process. But it is hard to say, though, because we have so little footage, right? I'd love to see more of this game and do more comparisons. But at the moment, it's sort of ambivalent as to those settings. But the key, not super, super stable, but I think it'll hold up really well in the 4K set from a typical viewing distance for sure.
Yeah, the two scenes are like 30 seconds of riding in on a horse and
It's not
and
much.
riding through the village that's burning, and I couldn't see too much beyond the frame rate increases.
They've got a new anti-aliasing and reconstruction method there that's not checkerboarding, which is what we had suspected in a DF Direct special last week, that it was a 4K checkerboard. It's not that. It's also not PSSR, but it does look very, very impressive. So we had the old PS5 code and the PS4 Pro code, or PS5 Pro code, running side by side there. And there were a lot of elements in the PS5 resolve that were not resolving correctly, like the checkerboarding was messing up the foliage presentation in particular. It looked to have a little bit of footage of this. It looks so much more stable. It's really impressive, and it looks really natural. It doesn't look over sharpened, but at the same time, it is resolving perceptually a full 4K worth of detail. It looks very smooth, very detailed, and very natural. Not too like crystal sharp, but actually like kind of natural, like what you'd expect to see from a film camera almost, where there's a little bit of a sharpness fall. Internally, in terms of the pixel counts, I was getting like 1440p to 1584p roughly for the pixel counts there. But again, the final image is what matters. And I actually think that Horizon probably had the best image quality I saw out of any. I did not, by eye, it does look like 60 FPS. Certainly when I was playing, it was running at a locked 60 FPS as far as I'm aware. I think that Guerrilla, they did talk a lot about trying to nail that 60 FPS refresh. Certainly what we've seen from Horizon on PS4, or rather not on PS4, on PS4 it's 30 FPS. I should say on PS5, it is capable of running at a very stable 60 FPS update. So I wouldn't expect anything different here. And Guerrilla is really, really good at hitting their performance targets. So yeah, I think it's probably basically just a 60 FPS experience. And like some other developers, Guerrilla is very, very confident that you should play the game at 60 FPS now. They do provide a 30 FPS mode that probably runs the game at a little bit of a higher resolution than typical play. But they did recommend to me you should play this game at 60 SS, which is something a lot of people are interested in, that comparison. I think we possibly, if we get some more footage of like Ratchet and Clank or indeed Horizon, although Horizon isn't PSSR, we might get a better sense of how these various solutions stack up to the PC version. My impression from Horizon is that it looked very, very good, but DLSS is kind of the king there. So saying that it's better than DLSS, I'm not sure I would. Again, I think in terms of raster performance, it probably is pretty close. But I think in terms of ray tracing, it's probably falling substantially behind, because what it appears to be on the PlayStation 5 Pro is they're still using the older AMD ray tracing model. They don't have a ton of dedicated hardware going towards ray tracing here. It doesn't seem like it to me. I could be wrong, but we've not seen the full disclosure, but I don't think there is much dedicated ray tracing hardware. They're running extensions, they're doing different things, and it is faster, but it's not a huge difference there. Also, the machine learning hardware, it remains to be seen how much of that is running on the GPU as opposed to a dedicated NPU, let's say, or dedicated like tensor cores as we see in the NVIDIA hardware there. So I think that the approach that AMD has gone with the PS5 Pro almost necessarily compromises a couple of those more forward-looking, a new Performance Pro mode, a new PS5 Pro mode, and then a cinematic and a performance mode. The cinematic and the performance mode run at the exact same visual settings to the modes as they did before. So you kind of get that point of reference, but they aren't actually that useful, right, anymore. The Pro mode is clearly resolving something to me that looked like 4K, just looking at the image. They didn't confirm any details or numbers or how they're doing it. Personally, I suspect it probably isn't PSSR, just based off the way the image is resolving, but we need to see more of the game to really know that. It is definitely resolving a lot more detail than the old PS5 performance mode, but like this is one of those games that on the base PS5 already ran really well, already looked really good, was already a native 1440p 60 with pretty good image quality. So here, those improvements in image quality maybe aren't so impactful as they might be in a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, where you really do want a higher quality image. The base PS5 is not delivering a very credible looking image on a 4K set, and the improvement is tremendous. This is not really that situation. Also, They did improve some of the contact shadowing. So when you get up close in Demon Souls to like a wall, for instance, you see a ton of intricate shadow detail, right, around the stonework in that wall. At least that's how it is on PS5. Here it seems like they're doing kind of a similar screen space technique, but they've increased that detail level so you get higher fidelity shadowing on that wall detail. So I think it is one of those upgrades that's maybe not the hugest, but it is nice to see Bluepoint going. Because Demon's Souls was already like a 4K 30 experience or a 1440p 60 experience without frame rate drops or dynamic resolution. But in some games that do use dynamic resolution or do have frame rate issues on the base PS5, like Elden Ring, for example, which has both. It has dynamic, a little bit slower pace than Spider-Man 2, and it's using PSSR as well, but it's using slightly higher base resolutions. I was counting in the footage that were provided, like 1440p came up a few times. It looks really, really good. Before, I think they had a little bit of that extra edge ringing, that extra instability in the image. Now it looks it looks a little bit better than maybe Spider-Man here, which is maybe a combination of the higher resolution plus slightly more forgiving game content. Like with Spider-Man 2, you're swinging by at like 40 kilometers an hour. Here, that's not quite the case, right? And it does, subjectively looking at it side by side, it does look very similar to the fidelity mode, I would say, even though you are at 60 FPS here. Each one kind of has its strengths and weaknesses, the old analytical IGTI technique they were using and the new machine learning-based PSSR technique. But they kind of trade off in such a way that I'd say that both at the moment, at least looking at the footage on site, because we don't have a ton of great comparison footage to look at here, they do look fairly similar. The fidelity mode quality level in that 60 FPS performance mode. That's really the big one to take away. And then other games are going to get these ray tracing enhancements that are quite compelling, but just getting that really high quality image that people are looking for in base PS5 but aren't getting with those 60 FPS modes, getting them on PS5 Pro is such an enhanced PC where you are getting a really high quality image, you're also getting a pretty high frame rate, and also possibly even in some modes